Hello. In a previous video, I talked about archaeological pottery, but with the main focus on observations that we can make on that pottery in order to infer technical aspects of its production, firing, and use. In today's video, I'd like to focus on a topic that I wasn't able to do more than mention in that video, namely the decoration that's on pottery. For very many years, archaeologists have had a great deal of interest in decoration on pottery as well as other kinds of artifacts, in part because they think that that decoration might tell us something about identity of the potters or the users of the pots. Sometimes that can be in terms of ethnic identity, other times more subtle kinds of identity, because the decoration can have certain kinds of messages embedded in it. We can also look at the decoration from the technical perspective, somewhat as we did with the manufacture of pottery, and some archaeologists would talk about technical style in the decoration.
Style doesn't necessarily have to do with decoration, but arguably decoration always involves style. Archaeologists differ in how they conceive of style. Some of them emphasize the conscious signaling that style can do, while others focus on more subconscious or subtle messaging, and may even argue that there's no real messaging at all. An important common denominator, though, is that style is transmitted within social groups. Several decades ago, there was considerable debate over the nature of style. James Sackett was influential in this debate. Although he doesn't explicitly say so, his views on style were probably influenced by evolutionary theory's concept of selection acting on random variability. Sackett notes that any artifact design reflects the maker's choices drawn from a very large number of possible variations. Sometimes those choices have an impact on how well the artifact functions, but some other choices make no functional difference at all. It is these passive or latent variations that Sackett considers to be style, and he specifically coined a term for this kind of style, isochrestic style. Because people make these choices within a social and historical context, they can acquire a social meaning, even though those meanings may not have been intentional. In other words, certain variations can become very common or dominant within a social group, being viewed simply as the way things should be done. Sackett recognizes what he calls iconic style, that signals some kind of identity, but he denies that even these kinds of cases have to be intentional. However, other participants in the debate, such as Martin Wobst, focused on style's ability to signal information. On this side of the debate, Polly Wiesner was particularly influential. She specifically defines style as formal variation that transmits information about identity. She agrees that style can be subject to selection, but denies that it's just a passive result of selection. She recognizes two categories of style. Emblematic style is a little bit like iconic style. It transmits a clear message about social affiliation or identity to a particular target audience. This can include things like national flags and religious symbols, and the signals here are definitely intentional. Wiesner focuses much more on what she calls assertive style. This is not as overt as emblematic style, but it's not passive either. It involves personal choices to select or promote certain features in order to express identity. Although assertive styles and emblematic styles can be coincident, they have no necessary association, and their rates of change tend to be quite different. Although decorative style on pottery can be emblematic, that kind of decoration tends to be quite rare. We can plausibly associate much of the variation in pottery decoration with Sackett's isochrestic style, and today this type of approach has tended to merge with chaîne opératoire approaches. I discuss the chaîne opératoire in some of my other videos, like those on lithics and research design. Some aspects of pottery decoration could be a good fit to Wiesner's concept of assertive style. For example, some extremely ambitious pottery designs could have the intent of signaling the potter's skill or artistic ability. Some archaeologists have even argued that potters use decorative style as a form of resistance against oppression in their society, whether those oppressors are foreign invaders or members of their own community. Finally, there's also an approach to style that doesn't fit into either Sackett's or Wiesner's categories. This one focuses on individuals' motor habits, which can be just as distinctive as fingerprints, and it's similar in some ways to handwriting analysis. Most of the methods used for decorating pottery fall within the category of finishing methods, but even primary and secondary forming methods can be used for decorative purposes. Aside from decoration, Sackett's isocrestic style occurs in all aspects of the pottery, including its overall form, small variations in detail, and variations in the fabric of the vessel. But even Wiesner's emblematic and assertive style can be expressed in forming methods themselves. For example, mold-made vessels leave a lot of opportunity for artistic expression. And that can even involve emblematic style, as in the case of this smoking pipe with a Masonic symbol. Although the primary purpose of paddling or beading is to thin the vessel walls, using a carved or textile-wrapped paddle allows the potter to decorate the surface of the pottery with texture. Even wheel throwing provides a lot of opportunity for decoration. For example, potters frequently use their fingers or a tool to make elaborate moldings on the rims of vessels. Even the overall form of the vessel can be highly decorative, and even involve emblematic style. For example, the shape of classical Greek amphoras signaled to wine buyers the region of origin of the wine that it contained. The house design of this Han Dynasty ceramic granary was purely decorative. But it's much more common for pottery decoration to involve finishing methods. Among the most important of these are slipping and painting. Even a very sloppy application of slip, rather than an all-over slipping, as on this early Bronze Age sherd, yields a decorative net-like pattern once the vessel is refired in an oxidizing atmosphere. But slips can also be used for much more complex painted designs. And the method of painting designs with slip on already fired vessels and then refiring them in a different atmosphere was a method used in many parts of the world. Even the elegant red figure and black figure vases of ancient Greece were decorated using this method. Eventually, potters learned that they could create a greater array of colors by adding minerals and other pigments to their paints. They also learned how to protect these painted designs with a glaze, which is a layer of glass. But even without glazes, potters can create a glossy surface on their vessels by burnishing them with smooth pebbles. A common way to decorate pottery is to impress its surface with a carved stamp of some kind, or with the end of a stick or a bone or a spatula, or even just a fingernail, or with a piece of fabric or a rope or twine. In a similar vein, potters can roll a textured wheel or cylinder, or even just a cord-wrapped stick, to create repeating patterns across the surface of the vessel. Another suite of decorative methods includes incising the surface with some kind of knife or flint flake, or combing it with a multi-pronged tool like a fork, or even carving away areas of the surface with a knife. Some forms of decoration involve piercing the walls of the vessel with a pointed instrument, or even cutting window-like perforations, as in these Chalcolithic stands from Israel, or in the lace-like decoration on the borders of this plate. Another common method is to attach pieces or strips of clay body to the surface of the vessel, sometimes followed by impressing to make rope-like bands across the surface. But sometimes the pieces are made in other shapes, such as animals or human figures. Although today's focus is pottery, it's worth noting that the same design principles can apply in other media, such as wall paintings, jewelry, clothing, and carpets. In fact, many years ago, the archaeologist James Millart suggested that the decoration found on pottery from Neolithic sites in Southwest Asia was inspired by the designs of carpets, as in the case of this Samaran painted platter. As decoration on pottery can be quite complex, it's not always obvious how best to compartmentalize it for analysis. When our evidence consists of substantially whole vessels, our segmentation rules might begin with dividing the vessel into panels of decoration. Within those panels, or on individual sherds, we might then identify design elements, each assigned to a particular class in a classification. One problem with this approach is that it treats all the differences as equally important, even though some classes are simply variations on a theme. As just one example, note how these two design motifs, 68 and 69, are virtually identical. Stephen Plogg offers a different approach that involves first identifying major elements that he calls primary units, and then identifying attributes of those units, such as whether they're filled with solid color or with some kind of hatching. He then identifies what he calls secondary units, which are sometimes, but not always, attached to primary units. Other attributes of units include whether they are rectilinear or curvilinear, and the nature of their interaction with other units, such as being parallel or merging. Plogg applied this system to design elements similar to those that William Longacre had used in his analysis of pottery from the Carter Ranch site. But this approach is not exclusive to southwestern pottery or even painted decoration. For example, we can try to apply a modified version of Stephen Plogg's segmentation rules to Yarmoukhian Neolithic pottery from Jordan. Previous systems for analyzing Yarmoukhian decorative motifs are similar to William Longacre's ones for the American Southwest in that they treat all the categories in the system as equivalent in importance. Working from Stephen Plogg's approach, we could identify primary units such as bands and triangles, each of which can have a composition that is plain, hatched, or with chevrons. Then we can have appended secondary units such as chevrons and triangles, and unappended secondary units such as dots and crescent shapes. Many of these units can be straight, zigzag, or curvilinear in shape, and they can frequently be doubled or tripled and interact in various ways. One approach to variation in decoration goes beyond even Sackett's isochrestic style in treating stylistic differences as unintentional. As in handwriting analysis and some kinds of epigraphy, this approach involves analyzing tiny variations that result from individuals' motor habits. For example, 5 different artists painting substantially the same floral designs on pottery will not execute the brush strokes in exactly the same way. Each artist will use a different number and sequence of strokes, and will also vary in how they hold the brush and how much pressure they apply. We can identify these pattern differences by a very careful examination of the decoration. In principle, this can actually allow us to identify individual potters in much the same way as an art authenticator could identify a Rembrandt or a Botticelli. In the 1960s, a number of archaeologists pioneered an approach that came to be known as ceramic sociology. One of the first of these was William Longacre, who used the design motifs on painted pottery to try to identify social groupings in the site of Carter Ranch in Arizona. His working hypothesis was that the inhabitants of this pueblo practiced matrilocal residence. To test this hypothesis, Longacre had to make several assumptions. He explicitly assumed that the potters at the site were women, and that they learned how to pot from their mothers. He also assumed that the choice of motifs would be more or less unconscious, although influenced by the kinds of motifs that the mother habitually used. There's also an implicit assumption that the discard locations where the archaeologists found the pottery are close to where the pottery was made and used. If all these assumptions were correct, we might expect pottery motifs to be spatially clustered if matrilocal residence was practiced. Longacre conducted statistical analyses of 175 design elements already mentioned, and plotted the relative frequencies of design motifs on a series of maps. Here, for example, we see the proportions of pottery with design element 98, a line with appended dots. This motif is clustered in the southeastern part of the site, where the excavation trenches encountered most of the site's burials, and it's rare to absent in most of the room blocks, although occurring on 7 to 10% of the pottery in 2 rooms and Kiva 1. Having studied the spatial distribution of all the design motifs in the excavated rooms and trenches, Longacre concluded that there were 2 or perhaps 3 clusters of design motifs, each associated with a kiva. Consequently, he accepted his hypothesis of matrilocal residence. Soon after, James Hill conducted a very similar analysis at the site of Broken Cay Pueblo, not far away from Carter's Ranch. He designed this as an explicit test of Longacre's hypothesis, using a random cluster sample of rooms within this larger pueblo. He also further developed the statistical methods and used new sources of evidence besides the pottery design elements. In this pueblo, Hill found 5 spatial clusters that arguably fell within 2 larger groups. Like Longacre, he interpreted these as corporate social groups that were probably matrilocal residence groups. Today we can find fault with some aspects of these analyses, including some of their statistical methods, but these studies were important for showing the potential of decorated pottery for inferring social relationships. A very different approach concentrates not on the content of the design motifs, but on the way they are ordered or structured. Shanks and Tilley, for example, use structuralism to analyze decorated pottery from Swedish prehistoric sites. They take advantage of the fact that the decoration occurs in bands from the top downward, and they code each design motif with a letter. Since the same design motifs sometimes reoccur in different bands, this results in sequences of letters somewhat like the rhyming patterns in poetry, such as the AB, AC, AD seen here in this beaker, or AB, CD seen here on this bowl. What's important here is the order of design elements and not the content of the elements themselves. In structuralism, it's common to interpret patterns in terms of dualities, like male and female, or wild and domestic. Shanks and Tilley privilege the duality of open and closed, choosing to infer that the decoration had something to do with open societies. Such a structuralist approach could have some traction anywhere where the pottery decoration tends to occur in bands or zones, such as Iroquoian pottery from the northeastern part of North America. In this type of pottery, decoration is concentrated on the upper part of the vessel and especially on the thickened rim called a collar. Even in pretty simple examples like this one here, one could arguably identify 6 different zones of decoration, some of them having simple lines, right-hatched triangles, or left-hatched triangles, with a pattern of AABA or AABCA, depending on how you want to categorize the hatched triangles. This approach could also work well in the case of pottery that has zones of painted decoration. However, the bigger question is how we should interpret the results of such analysis. For example, what are we really to make of Shanks and Tilley's open and closed structures? Rather than impose our own interpretation of the structure, perhaps we should instead treat these structures simply as another source of evidence for communities of practice. In other words, for the social groups within which potters learned how to decorate pottery. For example, if we found that pottery with the 3 different structural schemes shown here tended to cluster in 3 distinct contexts, this might be evidence for distinct social groupings, somewhat like Longacre's inferred matrilocal groups, but on a rather different basis. When potters decorated their vessels with figurative art, it created the potential for telling stories. While that potential was realized in many parts of the world, it's particularly notable in the case of Greek vase painting, even as early as the Mycenaean period, as in this chariot scene here. But narrative scenes became particularly well developed in the classical and Hellenistic periods, when vase painters developed a sophisticated vocabulary to depict space and time in their works. The fact that viewers of these vessels were very familiar with the mythological stories they conveyed made it easier for them to interpret even subsidiary parts of the design, like small animals and artifacts that figured in the story or helped set the stage. Archaeologists today can also interpret these stories because we're familiar with the myths through the works of authors like Homer. But our interpretations of the narratives would be much cruder if we didn't have that knowledge. In cases where we lack ancient textual evidence, stories surviving in modern communities can sometimes help us interpret the art on the ancient vessels. But in some cases, we may only have the interactions among design elements to help us infer more general aspects of the narrative. This could require some very complex analysis, perhaps involving a complex system of segmentation and differentiation rules like the one that Degas and colleagues used for cylinder seals. This brings to a close this brief introduction to the main methods for decorating pottery, as well as some of the ways that archaeologists have tended to interpret decoration on pottery. If you'd like to learn more about this topic, you can check out Chapter 12 of my book, The Archaeologist's Laboratory, published by Springer, and also Prudence Rice's book, Pottery Analysis, a Source Book. If you'd like to be alerted when I publish new videos, please click on the subscribe button down below. Thank you, and stay safe.